She was working as a clerk at a Douglas aviation factory near Chicago when a test pilot invited her to go flying. Looking down over the city, she fell in love with flight. A year later, she heard that the legendary Jackie Cochran was coming to town to interview women interested in training to fly military aircraft. She applied, passed the physical, and endured the same training as any other flight cadet. As one of the WASP, the Women's Air Service Pilots, she flew 7 days a week through an intense political firestorm that swirled around her and her colleagues. The question was whether women had a place in military aviation, and her career and the career of hundreds of other WASP answered in the affirmative. She is Lorraine Zilner Rodgers, and she is a legend of air power. Lorraine Zilner was born in Chicago on September 11, 1920. Her mother was a homemaker, her father an accountant. She was an active girl, always playing outside, and the only thing that seemed to bring her to a halt was an airplane passing overhead.
The planes from Chicago Municipal used to fly over the house, and when I'd be out in the yard gardening or doing any of those things outside, I'd hear them and look up, wonder where they were going, why, how did that plane stay up there? It was so big.
After graduating from the University of Illinois, she returned to Chicago and took a job with the Austin Company, which was building a new factory for Douglas Aviation on what would eventually become O'Hare Field. When the factory was complete, Zilner transferred to Douglas, and one day a test pilot asked her if she'd like to go up for a ride. She jumped at the chance and was, she knew, hooked on aviation.
So every weekend I took my earnings and went right out to the local airport, little teeny 2x4 grass runways, and I spent my entire salary on lessons.
One day out on the flight line, she heard that the Army was starting a new program that would train female pilots to fly military aircraft.
The WASP program was the brainchild of aviatrix Jackie Cochran, who about 1939 came to the conclusion that a lot of people in the United States had, which was that ultimately America would be involved in the war in Europe.
Cochran grew up in poverty in Florida, founded a highly successful cosmetics firm, and learned to fly as a way of staying in touch with her far-flung businesses. She had become a famous air racer, breaking dozens of flight records.
She was a very generous lady, but I sort of classed her. She couldn't stand tranquility and complacency, like if you were at a dinner table of say 12 people and she was in charge. I don't think she could stand everybody being happy and joyful. She'd have to generate some explosion or something like that to kind of break it up, and that's the way she was. And she was a very aggressive gal, and basically when she wanted to do something, she did it. You didn't want to get between her and it.
Soon after winning the Bendix Trophy in 1938, Cochran formulated an idea for a military corps of women that would take over the non-combat flight roles that had always been reserved exclusively for men. Politically astute, Cochran took that idea to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, explaining that the WASP, as they came to be known, would free up hundreds of male pilots for combat. Mrs. Roosevelt referred Cochran to General Hap Arnold, who suggested that she have a look at England's Air Transport Auxiliary, which used women to ferry airplanes around Great Britain. His suggestion was more political than heartfelt. He knew full well the firestorm that would result from letting female pilots into the Army Air Force and wanted nothing to do with it. Cochrane, however, went ahead to England, saw how successful the British program was, and returned to the United States with a formal plan to create a branch of the Army Air Force for women. She wanted her group to be organized as military pilots, to be trained in strategy and tactics, and to take on more than just plain ferrying responsibilities. Arnold suggested instead that she put together a volunteer group of 25 American women to go to Great Britain and fly there. While Cochrane was out of the country, the Army instituted an alternative plan to use women as pilots. The alternative had been put forward by Nancy Love, a polished former student at Vassar who'd married a Boston aircraft manufacturer. Love was an interesting counterpoint to Cochrane. She was diplomatic, where Cochrane was brash, and she was less concerned with creating a new women's branch of the Air Force than she was with just getting women flying. Her plan landed on the desk of the Ferrying Command, just as it was beginning its search for experienced pilots. And in September of 1942, the Army Air Force created the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, with 27 female pilots and Nancy Love as director. When Cochrane returned from England, she quite predictably hit the ceiling.
Jackie's approach, both with the WASP program and personally, was to be very competitive, very driven. Nancy Love was a little more laid back, a little more refined, and their programs, I think, each reflected their respective personalities.
Cochrane's personality dominated the decision-making process, and in the end, she got command of a new program, the Women's Airforce Service Pilots. When the smoke cleared, Nancy Love ended up working for Jackie Cochrane. And so it was Jackie Cochrane who arrived in Chicago to recruit female pilots to the war effort. And it was Jackie Cochrane who met with the bright-eyed, fresh-faced Lorraine Zilner.
Well, I was in total awe of the woman because she was world famous, had broken every speed record. I mean, just unbelievable.
A month after meeting with Cochrane, Zilner reported for her physical at Fort Sheridan outside Chicago. No one at Fort Sheridan had ever heard of a female pilot, and she spent much of the day showing her orders to disbelieving officers. When she finally reached the doctor's office, the medical staff seemed stymied. They'd never given an Army physical to a woman before and had no idea where to start. Lorraine Zilner and hundreds of other female pilots across the country were getting their first lesson about life and what it would be like in the Army. Sweetwater, Texas, where the Women's Air Force Service Pilots set up their training, was like most places where the Air Force conducts its training, dusty, isolated, almost forgotten. But in 1943, when Lorraine Zilner arrived at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, it seemed like the most exciting place in the world. She was surrounded by women like herself, pilots who were so thrilled by the opportunity that they were not discouraged when the Army required them to pay their own way to training.
Then we were assigned our flight gear, which was pathetic, because we got all the hand-me-downs from the men. And my last name started with a Z, and I was always last in line, one of the shortest in the class, and I got a 48 long man's flight suit. The crotch came to my knees, and we all put these things on, and we were just, you know, it was unbelievable.
Together, the brand new WASP tightened their belts, rolled up their sleeves, and pulled and tucked themselves into their new uniforms. They were being paid $150 a month to fly, and that seemed like a pretty good deal, even if the Army was charging them $1.65 a day for room and board.
The women ranged in skill and knowledge very much the same way their male counterparts did. Some of them were extremely good and had a lifelong affiliation with aviation. Some of them had come into it fairly recently and were still developing the necessary skills and understanding of how aircraft worked.
Cochran knew that her WASP had to meet the same training standards as any other military pilots. But she also knew that if the WASP program itself was going to pass muster, her pilots had to be personally above reproach. She had chosen her group from more than 25,000 applicants and eventually brought more than 1,800 to Sweetwater. Those who were selected were chosen as much for their personal deportment as they were for their potential as pilots. Male pilots, Cochran knew, could drink and carouse all they wanted, but females had to behave themselves.
She was very stern, strict. As a matter of fact, at Sweetwater, she was so strict with the rules and regulations that we called it Cochran's Convent. She really laid down the law as to what we could do and couldn't do.
Zilner loved the flying, and like the other WASP in training, wanted to do nothing to put the program at risk.
I always sang when I flew. I truly was happy up there. And I'd sing. I wouldn't dare sing anyplace else, but I was up there all alone. I could sing to my heart's content. And, it's wonderful.
She sang through basic, advanced, instrument, and night flight training. Down in the classroom, she studied the physics of flight, mathematics, meteorology, and Morse code. She learned to take apart, repair, and reassemble aircraft engines. After each segment of training, she was tested by regular Army check pilots, and she passed her tests with flying colors. She was just beginning to feel like a real pilot when, flying one afternoon out over the Texas prairie, she got into trouble.
Suddenly the plane just flipped over upside down and went into an inverted spin. I worked with it. I did everything that we had ever been taught. Nothing made any effect on the plane. And then when I looked out and saw how close I was getting to the ground, I knew I had to get out.
She struggled with the canopy, but managed to get herself out of the plane, barely feeling the thump as the plane's tail hit her leg. Her parachute opened perfectly, and she fluttered down to the ground.
So I'm laying there and I'm thinking, am I alive? Am I dead? Where am I? And suddenly I heard galloping of horses. And I thought, oh, I'm in Texas. Of course, I'm in Texas. And up come these horses, and two cowboys jump off of their horses and came running over. And one of them unzipped my leather jacket and opened my tie, and the other one pulled my helmet off, and all my long hair fell down. And he said, "My gosh, it's a little girl."
One of the first women to destroy a government aircraft, she was sure that her career was over.
I went back to my quarters, and I just sat there, and I thought, oh, this is it, start packing. And all of a sudden, I heard my name on the loudspeaker system. Lorraine Zilner, report to the flight line. And I thought, oh. So I went down the flight line. There's my instructor sitting there. And he said, come on, we're going up.
Zilner put on her misfit flight suit and climbed into the cockpit. An investigation showed that someone had cut her plane's control cables, attempting to kill her for the high crime of being a female pilot. The saboteur was never found. But that day, it didn't much matter. She was back in the air, flying, and the pilots around her, male and female, understood that what was more important to her than anything else was to get back up into the clear Texas sky. If back in Washington there was still debate about whether it was proper for women to fly, in Sweetwater, Texas, it was clear that Zilner had earned her wings. General Hap Arnold himself pinned Lorraine Zilner's pilot's wings on her. The graduation ceremony at Sweetwater was bittersweet. The WASP had succeeded in learning to fly the military way, but now they were going to be scattered out around the country to more than 100 different bases. The Army Air Force assigned Zilner to the 5th Ferrying Group at Love Field in Dallas. The war was raging around the world, and newly manufactured aircraft were desperately needed at all theaters, so the work was unrelenting.
We would pick up our orders in the morning at our squadron commander would give to us, and we would, by ourselves, just take off and go to whatever factory the plane was coming from. And we would get there, and as the plane came off the assembly line, we would take it up and test it and put it through its paces, and if everything was all right, which obviously it was, we would take it down and accept it for the Army Air Forces, Air Corps, and ferry it to its destination, which was either a base where they were training or to its point of embarkation.
Zilner traveled all over the country, flying all kinds of aircraft. She and the other WASP worked 7 days a week for weeks on end, always either flying or in transit to fly. And everywhere they went, they faced the same surprised looks.
In those days, I mean, we'd hop out of planes and the crewmen would come up and we'd take off our helmets and down would come this long hair. They'd stand there. They didn't know whether to talk to us or call for the MPs.
There was a certain amount of animosity between the male pilots and the women of the WASP. We were not as enlightened as a society as we are today, and a lot of the men, A, felt threatened by the concept of a woman who might be as good or better in the cockpit, and B, of course, a lot of them felt that women simply weren't competent to be doing that kind of work.
As the WASP got more ingrained in the Air Force, two things happened. On the flight lines, they earned a grudging respect. They were, after all, muscling heavy, difficult-to-fly aircraft around the country without apparent difficulty. But back in Washington, their success seemed to create more rather than less controversy. Jackie Cochran's insistence that the WASP be treated as military pilots rankled many of the powerful men who controlled the military's purse strings. As Cochran pushed harder and harder to get the WASP the same standing that male pilots had, the politics of the situation grew more starkly divided. They flew the same non-combat missions as male pilots, not only ferrying planes, but also pulling live-fire targets through the air, a mission almost as dangerous as combat itself. They helped train bombardiers and other flight crew members, and they died at the same rate as their male counterparts while pushing badly needed aircraft through bad weather to where they were needed. Their dedication never came under question, but they were nonetheless paid less than men doing the same job and had no access to military life insurance. They weren't eligible for promotion, which meant that their $250 a month salary would never rise. Congress, in a fit of pique, even banned the WASP from flying outside the boundaries of the United States, which meant they couldn't ferry planes overseas or even to and from factories and bases in Canada. In June 1944, Congress considered a bill that would have made the WASP full-fledged members of the United States Army. During the debate, one representative pointed out that the WASP had exceeded the expectations of even their most fervent proponents, that their service was remarkable by any standard. Congress remained unmoved and voted not to give the WASP full military status.
38 of our women were killed. And, you know, when their remains were sent home and buried at their family's expense, We went to Texas at our own expense. Their burials were at their family's expense, and the families couldn't even hang a star, the gold star, in their window. And it wasn't even at the funeral, no military honors, nothing, no recognition at all.
After months of ferrying aircraft, a badly burned out Zilner was transferred to Waco Army Base, a basic flight school for male cadets. For the next few months, she flew as a maintenance test pilot, making sure that planes that had been repaired were safe enough for the men to fly. She was there late in 1944 when the Army Air Force brought the WASP experiment to an end. The WASP were mustered out of an Air Force they had never really been in. Not unexpectedly, they paid their own way home. Zilner returned to Chicago and got a job in the operations department at Glenview Naval Air Station. There, she met her husband, Captain George Rodgers, a Navy fighter who'd returned from the war wounded. They married, had 4 children, and for the next 30 years, she followed his career, moving from place to place as the Navy assigned him to different air groups. And all during that time, there were quiet efforts being made to get the WASP recognized as having been part of the Air Force. As the drumbeat built, it became clear that it was not coming from just the WASP themselves. The generation of women behind them, many of whom had sought careers in both civil and military aviation, wanted the WASP to get their due. At public appearances, reunions, and civic functions, Lorraine Zilner Rodgers and the other WASP found themselves on the receiving end of unsolicited standing ovations. In 1977, Senator Barry Goldwater introduced into Congress a bill that would recognize the WASP as having been a real part of the Allied victory in World War II. The bill gave the WASP honorable discharges from the Army Air Force, granted them the full status and benefits afforded other military veterans, and recognized that their actions in wartime had been courageous and determined.
We were the first women pilots to fly military aircraft. And as a result, we opened the doors for today's women military pilots, women airline pilots, women corporate pilots, women astronauts. We opened the doors for them. And every time we come in contact with any of them, they always say, "Thank you.